Welcome to the Stories of Survival Unit, officially. Well, that was probably terribly cringy. I wanted to use the actual Destiny's Child version of that song, but Beyonce gets you a boom, hard copyright block on YouTube. Okay, hi, welcome back. So this is our vlog for week 6 of at-home learning. Week 6, I can't believe it. But guys, I'm so excited to finally be starting our Stories of Survival unit because it is low-key my favorite unit we do. So the reason we're gonna be able to be successful with this unit is I got a short little window of time where I was able to break into school and liberate the learning materials. Bag secured. Today we're going to talk about the concepts of connotation and denotation and talk about how they help shape an author's perspective in a text. We're also going to dive into our first story of survival, or not, the story of Christopher McCandless as told in the book Into the Wild by Jon Krakauer. So let's start with the mini lesson, shall we? Yes, we shall. Beautiful. Okay. The beauty of the English language is that we have so many words at our disposal that have pretty much the same meaning. But why that's a beautiful thing is that they're all slightly different to help you as a speaker and a writer better capture exactly your intention and your meaning when you are communicating. Think of the word big. How many words do we have to describe big, large, extreme, gargantuan, gigantic, enormous, mammoth? I could think of more if I'd tried, or if I had, in a shocking turn of events, actually prepared and taken notes for this video instead of just talking off the top of my head. Ooh. So basically, these words all share a denotation. Denotation is the dictionary definition of a word. All of these words, at their heart, mean large in size or scope. But these words also have different connotations. A connotation is kind of an attitude, emotion, or judgment that is attached to the word. It's a meaning that we have given to a word. A good example I always go to explain connotation is the word cheap. Cheap technically means inexpensive. The denotation would be that cheap means something that has a low price or cost. The connotation or attitude or judgment that we have associated with the word cheap is that something that is cheap is also lower in quality. Let's take a real life example of this. Last year, the cheer team was selling uniforms that they had left over, and they wanted us to promote it on student news. So I had the cheerleaders film a promo for me to put on the show. Isabel was on the student news crew, and I had talked to her about this in advance. And part of doing news and media and promotion is being careful with the words you select because you are trying to send a specific message to your audience. I had told Isabel many times before we filmed not to call the uniforms old. Why do you think that is? The word old has the correct denotation or dictionary definition. The uniforms were not new or current, they were from the past or long ago. So old is technically correct. But old also has a connotation that might turn someone away from wanting one of these uniforms. Old can also kind of convey the idea that something is in bad shape, is out of date or out of fashion, and is kind of undesirable. That is the attitude or judgment we have attached to that word old. Take a look at the promo. though I'd asked her not to use the word old, she did. So I tried to put a different connotation in people's minds by suggesting other words that had the same denotation: vintage, retro, throwback. All of those things have the same denotation. They also mean from the past, from long ago. However, those words that I suggested also have a connotation of something being from the past, but kind of cool or in fashion or worth remembering. One of my favorite things a student has ever said when I've been doing this lesson was last year when I used this example. I asked what connotations were associated with the words that I had suggested. And he said, it's old, but it's cold. Perfect, right? So that's the basic idea behind connotation and denotation. As a writer or speaker, I need to be aware of the connotations of the words that I'm choosing to use. If I'm not careful, I'm not necessarily getting my message across, and I'm planting different ideas in my audience's mind other than what I'd really like to convey. As a reader, it is super important to pay attention to words that have connotation, or another way I like to say it is show judgment. In the world of media and promotion, we're selling items, but in the world of reading, we're selling ideas. Your author is always going to be selling you an idea. If you're aware of your connotations and can tell what your author's trying to sell you, you get to decide whether or not you buy it. So we're gonna practice with this concept this week and next. This week, I'm going to lead the discussion more and kind of model for you how I determine an author's perspective by paying attention to the connotation of words used. Next week, it's going to be a little bit more on you to look at a text and tell me what is the author's perspective based on the connotations of the words used in the piece. Now to the text. My freshman year of college, in my composition class, I was required to read this book, Into the Wild by Jon Krakauer. That's all I'm going to say at this moment. We'll get back to my opinions on this book and the subject at the end. I don't want to sway you by using words with connotation that show my judgment. I shan't reveal it till later. So in this composition course, we read this book and then I had to write not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, but 5 different essays about it. 5 essays, 1 book. Oof. Early on, it became very obvious to me that what I was reading was pretty biased. It was not just a plain factual account of the life of Christopher McCandless. The way he wrote the text, Jon Krakauer made his perspective on Christopher McCandless extremely clear. So to model this for you guys, we're just gonna read the author's note. I have provided a scan of this text with the resources for this week. So feel free to follow along with that as I read or revisit it later on. Author's note. In April 1992, a young man from a well-to-do East Coast family hitchhiked to Alaska and walked alone into the wilderness north of Mount McKinley. 4 months later, his decomposed body was found by a party of moose hunters. Shortly after the discovery of the corpse, I was asked by the editor of Outside Magazine to report on the puzzling circumstances of the boy's death. His name turned out to be Christopher Johnson McCandless. He'd grown up, I learned, in an affluent suburb of Washington, D.C., where he'd excelled academically and had been an elite athlete. Immediately after graduating with honors from Emory University in the summer of 1990, McCandless dropped out of sight. He changed his name, gave the entire balance of a $24,000 savings account to charity, abandoned his car and most of his possessions, burned all the cash in his wallet, and then he invented a new life for himself, taking up residence at the ragged margin of our society, wandering across North America in search of raw, transcendent experience. His family had no idea where he was or what had become of him until his remains turned up in Alaska. Working on a tight deadline, I wrote a 9,000-word article which ran in the January 1993 issue of the magazine. But my fascination with McCandless remained long after that issue of Outside was replaced on the newsstands by more current journalistic fare. I was haunted by the particulars of the boy's starvation and by vague, unsettling parallels between events in his life and those in my own. Unwilling to let McCandless go, I spent more than a year retracing the convoluted path that led to his death in the Alaska taiga, chasing down details of his peregrinations with an interest that bordered on obsession. In trying to understand McCandless, I inevitably came to reflect on other, larger subjects as well. The grip wilderness has on the American imagination, the allure high-risk activities hold for young men of a certain mind, and the complicated, highly charged bond that exists between fathers and sons. The result of this meandering inquiry is the book now before you. I won't claim to be an impartial biographer. Good, because you obviously are not. McCandless' strange tale struck a personal note that made a dispassionate rendering of the tragedy impossible. Through most of the book, I have tried, and largely succeeded, I think, to minimize my authorial presence, but let the reader be warned. I interrupt McCandless' story with fragments of a narrative drawn from my own youth. I do so in the hope that my experiences will throw some oblique light on the enigma of Chris McCandless. He was an extremely intense young man and possessed a streak of stubborn idealism that did not mesh readily with modern existence. Long captivated by the writing of Leo Tolstoy, McCandless particularly admired how the great novelist had forsaken a life of wealth and privilege to wander among the destitute. In college, McCandless began emulating Tolstoy's asceticism and moral rigor to a degree that first astonished and then alarmed those who were close to him. When the boy headed off into the Alaska bush, he entertained no illusions that he was trekking into a land of milk and honey. Peril, adversity, and Tolstoyan renunciation were precisely what he was seeking. And that is what he found, in abundance. For most of the 16-week ordeal, nevertheless, McCandless more than held his own. Indeed, were it not for one or two seemingly insignificant blunders, he would have walked out of the woods in August 1992 as anonymously as he walked into them in April. Instead, his innocent mistakes turned out to be pivotal and irreversible. His name became the stuff of tabloid headlines, and his bewildered family was left clutching the shards of a fierce and painful love. A surprising number of people have been affected by the story of Chris McCandless' life and death. In the weeks and months following the publication of the article in Outside, it generated more mail than any other article in the magazine's history. This correspondence, as one might expect, reflected sharply divergent points of view. Some readers admired the boy immensely for his courage and noble ideals. Others fulminated that he was a reckless idiot, a wacko, a narcissist who perished out of arrogance and stupidity, and he was undeserving of the considerable media attention he received. My convictions should be apparent soon enough, but I will leave it to the reader to form his or her own opinion of Chris McCandless. Really, John Krakauer? Really? You'll leave it to the reader? Okay. So before I go off on another one of my famous Miss Cosler rants at authors, that should be a segment of its own, I would like to just state that Chris McCandless is a very polarizing figure. Where does that word come from? Polarizing comes from the word polar, right? When you think of a magnet, or like the Earth's axis, we have polar ends that are opposites. If you have a magnet and you have metal filings, they are drawn to one pole or the other. So a figure that is polarizing causes people to have two very divided opinions. They go to one side or the other. People either love them or hate them. There's very few people in the middle ground. Christopher McCandless is one of those characters. People feel essentially two ways about him, and I will use the author's own words to describe those. Here are the quotes that describe the two polar opposite opinions of Christopher McCandless. Some readers admired the boy immensely for his courage and noble ideals. So some people feel he is heroic. Others fulminated that he was a reckless idiot, a wacko, a narcissist who perished out of arrogance and stupidity, and was undeserving of the considerable media attention he received. Others thought he got what he deserved. Now, of these polarizing opinions, which one does our author hold? What is his perspective on Christopher McCandless? He makes that very clear. Even if he didn't break down in the middle of that author's note and essentially tell us how he felt, I could look at his word choice. So he describes Christopher McCandless in the beginning of the section with very positive words. He says he excelled academically, he's from a well-to-do family, he was an elite athlete, he graduated with honors. After his college graduation, we read that Chris McCandless took off on his own adventure. Now, let's examine the words used here. After describing McCandless giving away all of the possessions that his family had worked so hard to give him, he left his family without a goodbye, he gave away $24,000 that were in his savings account, he burned the cash in his wallet, he left the car that was given to him by his parents along the side of the road at one point. He burned his clothes, he burned his possessions. John Krakauer describes this as, and I quote, inventing a new life for himself. Okay, that's a relatively positive way to say that he abandoned everyone and everything he had ever known and destroyed or gave away everything his parents had given him. But I digress. Toward the end of the author's note, he talks about McCandless's asceticism. Asceticism is the practice of denying oneself any comfort or pleasure as a way to sort of spiritually purify yourself. In a religious context, monks and priests in the past would fast for large amounts of time, not eat any food. They would flog themselves, which means whip themselves, kind of emulating the sort of torture that Jesus endured prior to his crucifixion. All this thinking was, the more I suffer, the more I deny myself, the closer I am to God. That's the religious context. McCandless didn't really take it in a religious way, but he sought to deny himself all the comforts of modern society. I could get behind that a little more if those were comforts he had provided for himself. But as I mentioned earlier, everything he had, he was given by his well-to-do family. So the way that Krakauer describes this practice of asceticism, he describes it as a more noble cause. In college, McCandless began emulating Tolstoy's asceticism and moral rigor to a degree that first astonished and then alarmed those who were close to him. He doesn't elaborate on the alarmed part, but McCandless becomes extremely rude and off-putting to those around him, and honestly, it did not seem like he was in a good headspace before he took off for his wilderness trek. The last thing I want to focus on for word choice with this, although there's a lot we could delve into in this short passage, right toward the end there, the second to last full paragraph, for most of the 16-week ordeal, nevertheless, McCandless more than held his own. Indeed, were it not for one or two seemingly insignificant blunders, he would have walked out of the woods in August 1992 as anonymously as he had walked into them in April. Again, as you learn more about Chris McCandless's story, I don't think those were seemingly insignificant blunders. I have provided a link to a video that you can choose to watch if you would like to. It is not required viewing, but if you are intrigued by this story and want to know the whole package, the entire story of Chris McCandless, feel free to check that out. Long story short, Chris McCandless, after traveling across the entire country, entered a national park in Alaska that he had no knowledge of, had done no research on, and he had a map. He had an opportunity to take that map with him. But before he went into the park, he left it. He intentionally left it behind. That doesn't seem like an insignificant blunder to me. That seems like a bold and intentional choice. Because he had done no research, he didn't really know which plants were safe for him to eat, and he had been eating berries that made him very sick. He did not know that the spot he chose to camp was only accessible during the winter months, and that once spring and summer hit and all of the snow and ice began to melt, the river that surrounded that area flooded so much that he would be cut off from an exit route and stranded. Getting sicker and sicker from the food he was eating and being stranded and cut off from an exit route, Chris McCandless was ill, he was isolated, and he slowly starved to death. I would say overall, the words Krakauer uses to describe McCandless throughout this piece creates an admiring tone. He clearly respects Chris McCandless and maybe doesn't agree with everything he did, but overall he thinks he's admirable and worthy of respect. A little bit about me. I'm a very practical person and I've had to work very, very hard for everything that I have. So reading this in college, as someone who had had to get multiple scholarships to afford my tuition and who was having to work a job to continue to support myself through college, to read about someone who was rich, talented, gifted, had the whole world in front of him and then threw it away, that was a tough sell for me. I was more on the reckless idiot end of the spectrum than the admiration of noble ideals end of the spectrum. And what made reading the book particularly challenging for me is because I was over here and because John Krakauer was over here, we were never on the same page. Krakauer continues to describe him in a positive light, downplaying the details that make McCandless look reckless or heartless or cruel, and emphasizing the details that make him look like a hero, where I'm over here thinking the exact opposite. Now, I will say I have met just as many people who have read this book who loved it, who think Chris McCandless is amazing and what he did was so brave. So, my opinion is my opinion. I want to hear your opinion. I posed this question in our Stories of Survival discussion thread on Canvas. Let me know what you think. So guys, since I did all of that analysis this week, in terms of what you are doing is I'm just going to give you a little practice identifying words that have a connotation and talking about how that reveals a tone. So just practice with that, and there will be a short little check for understanding that's associated with that to make sure you're getting the idea. If you'd like, feel free to watch that video that I've included. I've also included the original 1993 Outside article about Chris McCandless. Understand that these are enrichment activities and you don't have to do them if you don't want to, but the author's note and the Outside article could be text used for your final reading log, which brings me to that, recap time. So, in terms of what we need to work on this week, number one priority, your Little Rock Girl 1957 quiz number 2 is due this Thursday. Again, I'm here for office hours. If you want to stop by and review with me, I can kind of guide you to the things you need to be checking out. You can also go back to the old vlogs that are in the Miss Cosler's Awkward at-Home Learning Update instructional vlog folder. They're all labeled with the topic that I covered, and you could rewatch the ones that have analysis of Little Rock Girl 1957. I will again emphasize that the vlog post for Thursday, April 16th contains many, many, many important items and answers to quiz questions. Please make sure you've watched that. So your newly assigned IXL for this week, the required skill at all levels is T2. Your optional extra credit is T1. The IXL skill that will be closed this week will be G2. So if you have not done any work with G2 by Friday, it will go in as a 0 in HI. If your SMART score is under 85% for G2 by Friday, you'll get partial credit. Today I am introducing your final reading log of the year. That is the blue reading log. It will be due on Friday, May 8th, and then you are done with reading logs. Woohoo! If you've run out of things to read at home, you are welcome to use the text that I am providing here. Little Rock Girl 1957, the Into the Wild author's note, or Chris McCandless article, or any of the texts that we're going to look at moving forward. Create Your Future is due this Friday. Remember, it is a pretty straightforward assignment. Come see me in office hours if you have questions. Just a couple quick notes. So I talked about this in class, but as a reminder, you're picking out a career goal for yourself and you are talking about all the steps necessary to achieve that goal. So like if you want to be a doctor, you're going to need to go to 4 years of undergrad and major in pre-med. You're going to need to get accepted to med school and finish med school. You're going to need to take your MCATs. You're going to need to do an internship. You're going to need to do a residency and lots of other things that I don't fully know because I'm not a doctor. I teach English. So whatever your career is, whatever your chosen career is at this time, the thing that you think you want to do when you grow up, just find out what it takes to do that and outline those steps in order. Sequence, remember? Sequence. Personal goal is something you want to do in your life, but it has nothing to do with your career. For me, I would like to travel someday. I don't travel that much right now because I haven't taken the steps necessary to achieve my goal. Things I need to do is I need to save money. Then I need to plan a trip. If my trip takes me out of the United States, I don't have a passport, so I need to get a passport. It's things like that that you would need to do to prepare for that personal goal. Bridges and barriers. Barriers are things that might be an obstacle for you achieving a goal. For example, for me, as I kind of mentioned earlier, I wanted to go to college to achieve my goal of being a teacher, but my family didn't have a lot of money, so I wasn't sure how I was going to do that. The bridges I built to get around it is I earned scholarships. I went to school at IUPUI so that I could stay home and not have to pay for my room and board. I worked when I was in school to raise money for my books and other expenses. Those are the bridges I built to overcome my barrier. So think about yourself, your life circumstances, and the career that you've chosen. What might be something you need to overcome, and how would you overcome it? So guys, I think that's pretty much it for this week. Again, if you have questions, message me or pop on office hours. I am pleased to say that more of you are taking advantage of that than have in the past. It's just always easier to talk through things than try to kind of do the back and forth with email messaging. Keep in mind if you get overwhelmed that there's that 1 week grace period on any assignment. You can turn anything in up to 1 week late with no late penalty applied. And I think that's it for moi. I'm gonna go keep reading, as you should as well. And remember, I don't know. Anyway, I hope everyone is well. I love and miss you so much. And I hope you have a great week. Talk to you later.